So welcome everyone. My name is Corey Eason. I'm the Student Support and Prevention Specialist here at Utah State Board of Education. And I'd like to welcome you to our first presentation on our webinars, our school-based mental health webinar series. And like again, I said, thank you for sacrificing this time, and we hope that this addresses the need that y'all want to cover. And so just a little bit about this first topic. Trauma-informed care has been a hot topic, and we felt like would be a great start to start this webinar series with. And as I introduce this speaker, I just want to just prep the stage that this will benefit every kid, and you can see how you can implement it in every aspect of your program. So at this time, I will turn the time over to Nick Bartlett, a school psychologist. And so here you go, Nick.
Okay, thank you, Corby. First of all, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak and have this platform. I hear we have about 5 million people logging in right now, so that's really great turnout. Just kidding. This is a new platform for me, so before I get into it, I'll just say I'm used to having an audience, and I get a little bit of energy off the humor, but this is a very serious topic. If I crack a joke, I'll just assume everyone at home is just rolling on the floor laughing. Okay, we're gonna go with that. So we're gonna start off today. I just want to introduce myself, give you a little bit more background of my experience as it relates to working with students with emotional behavioral disorders and trauma-informed care. So first of all, who am I? I'm a father. I have an 8-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. One of the biggest joys of my life, obviously, as most parents would agree. I've been a school psychologist since 2010. I've served multiple different disability areas, but it always seemed like I gravitated my passion and my opportunity to working with students with emotional disturbance and a lot of adverse life experiences. So it's been a blessing to kind of touch that population and build my expertise in that area. I'm also a Nurture Heart Approach advanced trainer. If you haven't heard about Nurture Heart Approach, I'll tell you a little bit more about that later when we talk about relationships, so I won't use that too much now. I'm also a certified trainer in something called CPI, Nonviolent Crisis Intervention. So I have experience teaching staff about nonverbal de-escalation and personal safety techniques. I'm adjunct faculty at Salt Lake Community College, and I've founded Co-Vitality Consulting, which is essentially helping families and schools implement the Nurture Heart approach to benefit the kids they work with. And I'm thankful my path started in California. One district I worked with in the same year, they introduced me to the work of Bruce Perry. If you haven't heard of Bruce Perry, he's a foundational researcher in the world of childhood trauma. He wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and that was something I was introduced to in this district. And they introduced me to Nurture Heart that same year, and it was just set my course as a professional from there on. So enough about me. I wish I could ask you about you, but here we go. So we're going to jump into our goals for today's presentation. Going to review some current statistics regarding children exposed to traumatic experiences in Utah. I understand there's been some previous training, so I hope it's not too much overlap, but at the very least it'll be good information to kind of frame why this is a crisis that we need to focus our attention on in the state of Utah. We'll touch on how traumatic exposure impacts the developing brain, what trauma-induced behavior looks like in the classroom. A lot of times we have symptoms we call ADHD, defiance, and often it's something based on trauma exposure the child's been through, and it's a learned adaptive response. And so if we reframe the way we look at behavior, and I'm not to say all behavior we see is caused by trauma. There's neurobiological reasons, temperamental reasons that we see certain behaviors in schools, but a lot of these practices work for children exposed to trauma, as well as those who just have neurotypical type of difficulties. So, and finally, we're going to talk more about strategies to support students exposed to trauma and toxic stress. And I'll be framing it through another one of the state's initiatives, the multi-tier system of supports. How can we embed trauma-informed practices into all 3 tiers of the MTSS framework that we're working on implementing here in the state of Utah. So that's my goals for today, and let's jump to it. What do you say? Okay, I always like to start on the bright side. We could do that. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Utah, beautiful state. They call it the Silicon Slopes for a reason. It has U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually recently ranked Utah #1 in innovation and entrepreneurship, and #2 in high-tech performance, #3 in economic performance in the study of all 50 states. So extremely business-friendly environment, a lot of economic opportunity. The unemployment rate is lower here than the national average, so that's a wonderful statistic. Utah also has the nation's largest average household size, 3.14 people, compared to the national average of 2.6. Top percentage of households headed by married couples, that's 60.6%, higher than national average. And it also is #1 in households with at least 1 child age 18 or under. So we have a very high child population in our state, which is fantastic. And of course, you can't get over the recreation opportunities out here if you're into skiing, hiking, snowboarding, all that good stuff. It's hands down one of the best places to live ever, right? I'm sure everybody out there could agree with me. But that's not to say that Utah isn't faced with its own set of challenges, okay? So let's look for just a moment on the other side of the coin, because it's almost like the tale of 2 different states sometimes here. With all those wonderful things going on in this state, we have some pretty troubling statistics that are going on as well. For example, we're higher than the national average with adults 18 or older experiencing any mental illness, 22%. And we're higher than the national average at adults experiencing serious mental illness, 5.1%. And consistently higher rates of self-reported lifetime depression, 20.8 versus 17.6. And I believe actually in the female population, it's actually much higher. I want to say at least 27% if you tease the 2 genders apart. And men are around 17%. And unfortunately, Utah has one of the highest rates of age-adjusted suicide in the United States as well, at 21.1 per 100,000. So no community, no matter how many wonderful things going on there may be, is immune to mental health difficulties, substance abuse, things along those lines, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Some additional statistics from the youth of this state. From the 2013 Youth Behavior Survey, who said in the year prior to this survey being taken, did they experience any of these bullet points here? So 25% felt sad or hopeless, 15.5% seriously considered attempting suicide, 12.8% made a suicide plan, 7.3% attempted suicide, and 2.1% of students suffered injury, poisoning, or overdose that had to be treated by a doctor or nurse. Okay, and it's not there to be a downer, but we're here to talk about our youth and talk about how to support them. And these statistics do relate that there's an epidemic going on. There's traumatic exposure, there's risky behavior going on, and really no community is completely immune to it. One more page of statistics, and then I'll keep moving, okay? Finally, out of all 50 states, Utah had the 7th highest drug overdose rate. We've all seen the billboards around. Opioid addiction is definitely an epidemic here in this state. Prescription drug deaths in Utah have increased by 400%, and since 2000, and 6 Utahns die every week from opioid overdose. And this is actually national statistics, but Utah statistics are equally in line that only 1 in 10 people with substance abuse disorder receives treatment. So we have a lot of adults out there suffering with substance abuse addiction and not receiving treatment. And we're here to talk about trauma exposure in kids. Well, when the adults are suffering from mental health or addictions, the kids will suffer. And so this is important statistics to keep in mind. Okay. Moving forward. Another fantastic blessing that speaks to Utah is the size of our refugee population here. And this is definitely a wonderful, beneficial thing, right? I would call it a bright side. You know, Utah has opened its doors to people needing safe haven. I know the LDS population can relate. There's been religious persecution in the history of the Mormon Church, and I know there's certain mentalities that support helping others from places who experience the same thing. So recent data is showing there are about 60,000 refugees living in Utah, mostly in Salt Lake County. And that's a fantastic thing. We want to open our doors to people who are having difficult life circumstances. We want to embrace diversity in our communities. The unfortunate side of it is these families are coming from war-torn countries, from really significant adverse circumstances, and the kids are another subset of the population who's been exposed to trauma, and trauma very different than we've experienced as typical population from the United States, from Utah, okay? So this tremendous act of goodwill is a blessing, and I believe in my heart these families are better here than they would be otherwise, right? But to give you a little snapshot, this is just a quick little summary of the arrivals by nativity, so where they came from for the year of 2015. 1,170 refugees were received here in Utah. 272 came from Somalia, 154 from Iraq, 132 from Congo. So some of the poorest and most war-torn areas in the country. And you know, as a school psychologist, I do work in an area where there's a high refugee population, and so we're working with these students, and beyond the language and maybe lack of education exposure that they experience, they're also dealing with potential post-traumatic stress symptoms that we have to be aware of to support them. Okay, here we go. Okay, so adverse childhood experiences, ACE, it's becoming a term that's pretty well known in popular culture in this country now, and that's a wonderful thing. We're going to dive into some ACE research. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, where have you been? Just kidding. We're going to go into a little bit of the background. I'll try not to spend too much time on it because I want to get to the current statistics, and I definitely need to leave time for what we're going to do about this, okay? So here we go. A little background on the ACE study. Originally completed in 1988. By Felitti and Anda, but it was repeated by Kaiser Permanente in the 90s. And they surveyed 17,000 California adults who were patients of Kaiser in San Diego about their medical history and their traumatic experiences in life. Now, the demographics of this original study were a little bit skewed, but the results were very interesting, and it makes you think, well, if the demographics were maybe more representative of the population, what would these results actually look like? And what I'm talking about, the participants in this original study were about 75% white and about 75% college level education or higher. The typical clientele of Kaiser Permanente, if you're not familiar, because I'm from California, you usually have a pretty good job if you have Kaiser insurance. So the results were really interesting. They revealed, and to back it up a little bit, the survey includes 10 questions, and we're going to go through the 10 questions here in a minute, and I'll have a challenge for you guys out there watching to tally your own ACE score, okay? But the survey consisted of 10 questions in essentially these three categories on the screen. So abuse, and that's physical abuse, emotional or sexual neglect, physical or emotional, and household dysfunction. And there's several different subcategories in there of household dysfunction. So of this original survey sample, almost 2/3, so about 64%, reported having at least one adverse childhood experience. Okay, that's one. And when you get through these questions, some of them are like, okay, did you go through any, was there a separation or divorce in the household? And that could be the one because of divorce rates. But the more interesting statistics is about 1 in 8 participants, about 13%, reported having 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Okay, so why does this matter? What they found is as the number of ACEs increase, the risk of negative health outcomes increase as well. Okay, and subsequent studies have found that life expectancy of people who have 6 or more is about 20 years shorter than persons with no ACEs at all. Okay, and there's interesting findings we'll talk about because these 10 questions cover a ton of ground, but they don't even cover everything that a child or any human being could be exposed to in their lifetime. And without getting too far ahead, we'll touch on that shortly. Okay, so that's the background on the ACE study. What I'd like you to do at home, if you have a sticky note, pencil, as we go through these questions, because I want you to just get a feel for what these participants were asked. Make a tally if any of these apply to you. If you're comfortable with it and it's totally confidential, when we get through the 10, text your number into whatever text.
We come to a private chat with Amanda.
Text with a private chat with Amanda. So if you guys know how to do that there at home, text a private chat with Amanda what your score is, and then like to just kind of get a feel for what the range of scores is out there, okay? So we'll start with these first two questions, and there's 10 altogether. So the first one, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard you had marks or were injured? That's the first 2. If you have them, just jot a little tally down. Okay, number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt, or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? And I apologize retroactively, I should have given you some disclosure. These questions ask some pretty graphic things, and if there's anyone's offended or having a hard time with that, I want to be sensitive to that, and I apologize for that. I do think it's important to bring to light, really what these questions are asking, so we don't say, oh, well, they only have one. Well, it could be any one of these, and any one of these could be pretty tough on a kid or an adult, okay? So please bear with me, and my apologies if anyone's having a hard time with these questions. Moving on. Number 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? And the last 2, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? Okay, and I think there's a couple, just looking at the statistics we've talked about with Utah already, that would come to the surface pretty quickly that we might take for granted, particularly number 9, I think, given the depression, the mental illness, and the suicide attempt statistics that we have in this state. Okay. Let's go to this. Okay, we have 0 so far. So we'll give a second for you guys to send your scores so far. Tally them up.
A couple more zeros and a 4.
Okay. And while they're coming in, I will also say, think of things that aren't on this list. For example, the death of a family member isn't even something mentioned in that. So if a child's experienced adverse child experiences, any of these 10, and you add something like a car accident or losing a close family member or friend, think about how much that's going to multiply the effect of the child's adverse experiences and overload their coping strategies beyond what they're also already struggling with. That's something I would say on buying time. Any more scores coming?
So a handful of 0,
okay. 2,
3, 4, and 5.
Okay. And I appreciate all of you out there participating. And, we're all in a professional world. We're supporting kids, but I think the range that we're seeing from 0 to 5 within the population participating in today's webcast, it speaks to the fact that, this the impact of adverse child experience can affect anyone. It can affect any community. And we'll go into a little bit more. Any other ones you want to throw out there?
Just positive comments.
Well, we like positive comments. Let's keep those rolling, okay? You're only allowed to put positive comments to Amanda. Thank you very much. Okay. So, moving on. And you'll find, I'm going to go into the ACEs statistics in Utah. What is our level? And you will find that actually compared to the Kaiser study, we're lower. So that's really good. But there's still struggles, there's still hardship. I feel like there may be an underrepresentation based on even current trends within the last 5 years with the increase in opioid addictions. So if we were going to get a snapshot, my gut would say we'd be a little bit higher than this, but the numbers are what they are at the moment that I'm reporting, okay? So ACEs in Utah, about 31% of adults that were surveyed reported having one or more, and you'll remember I think it was around 64% or something of the original Kaiser study. And 9% of residents have 3 or more reported ACEs. And that's actually a little bit closer to the Kaiser study. I think it was about 12.5%. So we're below those averages, but just about 10% of the population or that reported on this ACEs survey in Utah said they experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Okay, and we'll unpack a little bit more. So what are the physical, mental, and health-related outcomes when your ACEs scores are higher? But before we do, the most common ACE among children birth to 17 was economic hardship at 24%, divorce at 17%, mental illness and alcohol abuse were tied at 10%, and domestic violence was at 7%. So it gives you a little bit more of a snapshot of what exactly are our youth struggling with in this state. Okay. We're good on that one. So a little bit of feedback. What does this really mean? Okay. So if you had an ACE score of 4 or more, and for those of you who reported that you did have that, I will say don't freak out. Okay, we're okay, because there's certain variables that mitigate the impact of these adverse childhood experiences, and I'm going to talk about that next. So just because you have a 4 or a 5 or a 3 doesn't mean you should run to the doctor and get a physical or something, right? But if you are experiencing mental health concerns, there could be a correlation there. If you're having physical concerns, there could be a correlation there. So essentially, there's a positive correlation between the number of ACEs and negative health outcomes. So if it was on a chart, you'd have an arrow that went straight up, split at a 45-degree angle, right? As one goes up, the other one goes up. So a person with 4 or more ACEs is 12.2 times as likely to attempt suicide, 10.3 times as likely to use injection drugs, and 7.4 times as likely to be an alcoholic. A little bit more statistics for you. As well, a person with 4 or more ACEs is 2.2 times as likely to have an ischemic heart disease, 2.4 times as likely to have a stroke, 1.9 times as likely to have cancer, and 1.6 times as likely to have diabetes. And this is an interesting statistic, right? Because in psychological research, or most scientific research, we have a term that says, well, correlations, so as one thing goes up, the other one does too, that doesn't imply causation. So why is it then when we have adverse childhood experiences, I have a higher incidence of heart disease? Why is that? Why did I have a higher likelihood of stroke or cancer just because of what happened to me when I was a kid, right? And that may not make sense to a lot of people, but let's tease that out a little bit. Let's make it make sense. And one really great visual I want to share today that sort of explains the progression of why this occurs is this ACEs pyramid. Take a minute to soak that in there. And it's even titled the mechanism by which adverse child experiences influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan. So on the right side, you have your conception all the way up to your death, right? At the bottom end of the pyramid, we have those adverse childhood experiences that you experience. What those end up impacting, and I'll talk to the brain development here in a couple minutes, the neurodevelopmental progression is disrupted by that. Okay, so essentially the the brain, our physiological coping systems are dysregulated, and that can lead to behavior issues. It can lead to other mental health issues like anxiety, depression. And so I'm kind of working at the pyramid here. Social, emotional, and cognitive impairment really is what these things can lead to. Okay, and we know that when people are experiencing significant social, emotional issues, they may have higher risk behavior that occurs in order to cope. In a perfect world, they get the help they need. They take medication to get through it, or don't. They get counseling, whatever. But often, people fall through the cracks. They do the best they can, and they end up falling into high-risk behaviors that eventually lead to long-term health risks. Okay, and as that progresses through the lifespan, disease, disability, shorter lifespan is what we get. Okay, so it sort of explains the correlation, because adverse child experiences alone doesn't explain that, but it's what it causes. It's the developmental progression that unfolds as a result of those adverse childhood experiences. Okay. What's going on in Utah? I'm really excited that the state legislature is tackling this. You know, they want to be in the front of it. I actually was up late last night reading this House resolution, if you could believe it, and they nailed it. If you really want some fun reading, and I'm not entirely being sarcastic, if you read through this House resolution, it really accurately summarizes what the problem is, what we can do about it, and it compels state agencies, number one, to become informed. So here we are. You're welcome, state legislature. We're doing it right now, okay? We're helping everybody out there get well informed about the detrimental effects, short-term and long-term, of children, to children and adults from serious traumatic childhood experiences, number one. So information, let's get the information out there. That's where we start. Awareness is where the difference starts, okay? And next, implementing evidence-based interventions and practices that are proven to be successful in developing resiliency in children and adults currently suffering from trauma-related disorders to help them recover from their trauma and function at their full capacity and potential in school, the workplace, community, family, interpersonal relationships. So my hat's off to the state legislature and the leadership that's making this a top priority and compelling other state agencies, including Utah State Board of Education, to really get the information out there, and let's take a look at what we can do to help the children and families that are suffering from adverse childhood experiences. Okay. Gave a good plug, good shout out to the leadership. Here we go. Now let's talk a little bit more about trauma. What are we talking about, and what are the impacts on the brain and development when it occurs, okay? And by the way, I forgot to mention, if you have questions, you can certainly shoot them to Amanda. I'm going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to pause for questions. And if you don't, then that's cool too. But we'll make sure we field that in case you have anything just burning inside you. Just jot it down or send it to Amanda, and we'll keep that in mind for you. Okay. All right. Here we go. So there's two different types of trauma. First of all, there's acute trauma. So in acute trauma, it's a single exposure to an overwhelming event. Think of 9/11. Think of, I don't know, Columbine, things along those lines. Outside of that traumatic moment, the children typically experienced neurotypical developmental progression, okay? Now, in the case of complex trauma, so this is extended exposure to traumatizing situations, okay? So typically it's developmentally adverse, so it occurs from the 0 to 5 age range, or really somewhere in childhood, but the detrimental effects on neurodevelopment is when it really occurs in that 0 to 5 age range, or even prenatally in lots of cases, okay? Unfortunately, a lot of the trauma is interpersonal, so it occurs within the family when we're talking about complex trauma. And again, I kind of touched on that already, the early life onset. And so the reactions that we see from children, the troubling behavior that we see from children in the school setting, are really the function of, in the case where it's traumatic exposure, like I say, I'm not painting all behavior as trauma. I think it's important to be careful about that, okay? But in the case where it is, and we have information on that, unfortunately sometimes we don't, you have to understand this the child's behavior is an adaptive response that served their needs at some point, but it's being misapplied in the educational or other settings where we're having issues, okay? But at some point, it's important to help this child survive. That's the purpose of the behavior, right? So acute trauma, complex trauma, and more of what we're talking about today is the effects of complex trauma on children, okay? Okay, so this is kind of a nice little flow chart that breaks down complex trauma and the areas impacted. And one big thing I'll say, look at all these different areas. They're extremely relevant to the human organism, but they're all extremely relevant to education, right? So let's start at the top. Some of the domains impacted by complex trauma. Self-regulation and soothing. So they have a difficult ability to shift their internal states. So that means I'm upset and I have a coping strategy on how to calm down. And often this occurs when there's disruption in the attachment in the earlier, the parent-child reaction, because regulation starts externally. A baby cries and someone comes to soothe the baby, right? And by that response contingency, babies learn to self-soothe. It starts externally and then it goes internally. But when there's trauma or neglect that occurs, that skill is not learned, and so emotional dysregulation can occur. And kind of in line with that is attachments. We need a sense of secure attachment to know how to forge on with future relationships, right? But when that attachment is disrupted, we have a hard time having empathy with others. We have a hard time being attuned, and so emotionally in sync with others. There's just a total disruption in the flow of attachment. Cognition, and I'm going to talk in a moment about the neurosequential development of the brain, and where trauma occurs in a child's lifespan can really impact their cognition. So that could be their learning memory. Speech is a really common one impacted by early childhood trauma. And we'll talk a little more about that. Social and skills, so poor social awareness, social skills, reduced contact with peers, more social isolation. I think if you have attachment issues, maybe some social cognition issues, it's harder for you to relate to other people, other kids. Poor self-image, reduced sense of mastery, social isolation, so their self-concept and self-esteem is greatly impacted. And as we often see in the educational setting, their behavioral regulation, so their behavior is atypical for what a normal child would exhibit. So these are the areas that complex trauma can impact, and the areas that we have to try and address with our interventions in the educational setting. Okay. As I said earlier, regardless if you have a 4, 5, 3, or a 0, well, zeros, odds are, life isn't always easy for everybody, but if you have a 0, okay, I'm happy for you. I'm definitely happy for you. For those who have 4 or 5, but you still feel like you have a pretty good life, well, odds are you probably had some of these sort of mitigating factors present in your life. Okay, so what am I talking about? What are the main things that impact the extent of effective trauma? So one of the first things is the child's temperament, okay? How are they coming out of the womb? Are they pretty high-strung, needy, crying a lot? Are they pretty easygoing? And unfortunately, one thing that can influence a child's temperament is prenatal exposure. So the timing of a trauma exposure is another factor, okay? Prenatal exposure to drug or alcohol can have a lifelong effect compared to if a child starts having complex trauma occur around age 10. A lot of their neurodevelopment's done, and it's horrible, it's traumatic, but the long-term impact on the brain and their resiliency is going to be less impacted. So the timing is one thing, the temperament of the child, okay? A few things I would add also that I don't have on this is intelligence, actually. Some of the research shows intelligence can influence the impact of trauma. And think about it, intelligence is how quickly you learn something and the most minimal repetitions, right? So we can learn skills, we can learn self-regulation, and there's research that shows that intelligence can be a mitigating factor in the impact of trauma. The final one is your social environment around you. So if you've been through some complex trauma, but say you're removed from the home and you're in a very nurturing environment, it can be a major mitigating factor into the long-term impact of that trauma, okay? And I have some other subcategories there, the resilience factors within the individual, within relationships, especially relationships, parenting competencies, positive peers, caring adults, okay, and then a community, positive community environment, positive school environment, and then economic opportunities. So these are things that say the more of these that are present, the less likely the long-term impact of your average child experiences are going to be on your life. All right, let's talk about the brain. I'm a total nerd for brain stuff. I love it. So let's talk about it. First of all, let's talk about how the brain develops. It goes from the bottom up, so from the brainstem up, and from the inside out, okay? And that's what happens. That's how it unfolds in the womb and how it continues to develop as children get older. And there's research by Bruce Perry. He's developed this neurosequential model for treating children with trauma. It's evidence-based. It's expensive and hard to get off the ground in education, but it really says let's do a profile of the traumas the child's been through and the timing, because odds are their deficits are going to be tied to a certain brain region related to the timing of that trauma. And we can target our interventions at those areas, and if we bring those online and in sync and regulate certain areas developed on when the trauma occurred, then all of a sudden the other areas in the brain can start to come online. And especially in childhood, brain plasticity, so the ability to build new neurons and connections and get certain brain systems online, is much higher than when we become older. And so there's a critical period to try and intervene with children. But to a certain degree, brain plasticity occurs throughout the lifespan, just much more so in the early years, okay? So how the brain develops does really impact, and the timing of when that development is disrupted does impact what the behavior may look like, okay? And I like to think of this as like a flower. If you plucked a flower out of the ground before it was done growing, right? But you replanted it, you know, the odds are that flower is not going to grow to its full potential without a lot of extra nutrients and sun and love, basically, right? Doesn't mean it can't have a wonderful life and put out new seeds or whatever flowers do, pollen, but it does impact the development. And so the developmental trajectory of a child exposed to trauma, it changes their developmental trajectory, okay? So let's talk about some other really important brain regions that are related to trauma exposure, okay? I'm a big fan of a researcher named Dan Siegel, who's really big in interpersonal neuropsychology, I think that's what it's called, but he's huge in research behind mindfulness and emotional regulation. One of his books, Parenting the Whole Brain Child, is one I'm a big fan of, and I'll help with some strategies from that in a moment. But he really relates the brain. If you want a little model of it, if you put your hand up, put your thumb right here. In here we have the amygdala, and you can see it on the chart there as well, okay? And the hippocampus down here. They're lower limbic areas of the brain. They're in charge of emotional regulation. It's the brain's fire alarm, okay? The amygdala is. The fight, flight, and freeze response is occurring here, okay? Yeah, Siegel calls it the downstairs brain. We'll go with that, okay? So if we close it up, we kind of have like a half image of the brain right here, and where your pinky is your prefrontal cortex, okay? He calls it the upstairs brain. And these areas are really important to keep online in a really a synced brain, one that can manage emotional regulation. There's a constant dialogue between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, okay? But when a child or someone loses it, they blow their lid, right? And the amygdala is just sort of goes into that fight, flight, or freeze protective mode. And certain exposure, like fetal alcohol syndrome, is what they call a midbrain teratogen. So it impacts the amygdala pretty heavily and the prefrontal cortex. That's why children with fetal alcohol syndrome have really difficult time in school and poor emotional and behavioral regulation. I think that's all I want to say on that for now, because I'm gonna keep plugging along. To give you a little bit of just understanding of what goes on in the brain when we're having a traumatic response. I hope you guys are nerds for this like me, because I don't want to bore anybody, but I think it's relevant as we look at the interventions we're going to talk about soon. So here's a basic model of the brain. I don't know, say you're out hiking. I like to hike, okay? And you hear something rustling in the bushes. You may initially have a reflex to look, okay? That's your amygdala interpreting sensory input. And the amygdala interprets this input way quicker than other parts of the brain. So information comes from the top down, from our thinking and perception in our neocortex, but it also comes from our senses, and the amygdala interprets it first, maybe by nanoseconds, but you think about it, that's a survival part of our brain. We can't really sit around and think about it. So the amygdala kicks in without our really thinking about it. But, we're not cockroaches, we're not like animals without a neocortex, right? So we had this whole thing called the prefrontal cortex that has a dialogue between the amygdala. So if you're hiking and you hear the bushes rustle, you might look and say, oh, maybe it's just a rabbit. Everything is fine, okay? So this is the dialogue between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, okay? And that's what's typical for us. When we have an emotional reaction, we don't just flip our lid. We tend to kind of have this dialogue. And what they say in the psychology research, neurons that fire together, wire together, okay? It's like a muscle. So the more we have this healthy dialogue between our prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the more we're in control and be able to regulate our emotional states, okay? So what happens when a child is exposed to trauma is these areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, they don't really get the opportunity to participate in that dialogue, okay? Kids go, there's conscious response, okay. Kids go straight to the amygdala input because it's where it goes first anyways. And we have the cortex again, but it gets bypassed, okay? And it gets bypassed because they go straight into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So in the classroom, this might look like kids being defiant because they feel confronted. It could look like them up and moving and being what they call hypervigilant, so being hyper aware of their environment. In some cases, it might be them disassociating, spacing out, and withdrawing, which is sort of an opposite effect, but it's more of the freeze impact that our amygdala will create, okay? And the more they're triggered by their traumatic experiences, the more the survival loop happens, okay? And this is what our fight, flight, or freeze response. So now, neurons that fire together, wire together, this becomes a reflexive thing that the kids struggle very hard to deal with. And I work with kids every day, and I'm trying to teach them, and these strategies, a lot of things behind cognitive behavioral therapy are bringing these parts of the brain together to work together, okay? But it's a struggle, and the kids have to be walked through it to get to that point, and we have to reinforce them using that skill and those muscles so those connections come online and it gets easier for them, okay? So a little bit of rundown on what that traumatic fight, flight, or freeze response looks like. And we'll go into a little bit the impact of traumatic stress. So a healthy nervous system, we get angry, we're in traffic, whatever, throughout our day, running late, kids won't eat breakfast, you're getting stressed, right? But for the most part, we can regulate it. We ride the tides of our emotions, and we stay right in what they call a window of tolerance, that normal range, okay? And so that's a typical healthy nervous system. But what we see in children or adults who've been exposed to trauma, complex trauma in particular, is it looks more like this, okay? Over time, they have a harder time returning to baseline. So you can see we stay in the middle range on the first chart, and then on the second chart, they spike, stay up, and they come down. They seem okay. They spike again. So a lot of times when we're working with kids, it's like he went from 0 to 60, and it's like, well, you don't realize he was at 58 a second ago. His level of arousal is about a 58 all the time, okay? And then it gets stuck on. They have a hard time turning it off. That fight, flight, or freeze response is hard to turn off because your lower limbic parts of your brain are taking over. Your upper neocortex is not online when that's happening. So they're not going to respond to verbal strategies typically when they're super hyper aroused or demonstrating that discharge. And the opposite can happen, hypoarousal. Basically, there's even cases of traumatic induced coma where people go into full-on freeze mode and just look like they're sleeping and they're in a coma. It can occur. But the more typical when it's a low response is they're stuck off. They disassociate. They might express feelings of not feeling connected to their body, which is common in depression. And when we see students are cutting, often they disassociate from their feelings and they do it to feel. And it's pretty scary, but it works for these kids. So that parasympathetic response is when we're the low, not the high, and both can occur. So we can't discount the ones that are not being loud and disruptive, but when they're withdrawing and showing maybe symptoms of depression, it's likely also related to some traumatic stress. Okay. Just to kind of summarize, anyone who's taken Psych 101 in college or high school knows about Maslow's, and Maslow kind of nailed it, just to be honest with you, right? As we look at his hierarchy of needs, it kind of summarizes everything here. First of all, if you think of the adverse childhood experiences study, the first 3 tiers of that triangle are really what we're looking at, and if those are not being met, then the bigger picture things that make you human, that make you a happy human, won't occur. So, like esteem needs is your respect, your self-confidence, being accepted and valued by others. Okay, that's really a struggle when you struggle with feeling safe, when you struggle to connect socially with other people because of your traumatic exposure. And then self-actualization is just reaching your full potential, whatever that is as a human, is very difficult when these lower tier things are not met. So Maslow was kind of ahead of his game, and I think the ACEs study kind of supports that theory that when these things aren't met, it's very difficult for positive life outcomes. Okay, jump into the education part, and we have just about 30 minutes. I think we're in good shape. Okay. And this is a quick overview. It's hard for me to go into great depth about everything we do, but I have some great ideas that we can plug into the multi-tier systems of support within our state. And a lot of things work at all 3 levels. Some things are better at certain levels depending on the professional that needs to deliver them. So we'll get into that. Just a quick anecdote from a wonderful resource called Helping Traumatized Children Learn, from a student. I could see the math teacher's mouth moving in the classroom, but I couldn't hear a thing. It was as if I were in a soundless chamber. She was smiling and clearly talking. I just couldn't process a word of it. I had been an excellent math student, but the day she told me I was spacey and unfocused was the day I stopped connecting to math. My grades dropped, and they took me out of the advanced classes. This can happen. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes with kids, so we have to be kind of careful about how we approach them, and empathy is always a good first step. That's one tip I will say. Okay. Let's summarize some of the academic areas impacted, and I think we covered this a little bit in that flow chart of what trauma really impacts, but we'll go into a little bit more here. Okay. So language and communication skills are a big one. Okay. So hyperarousal, as I talked about, impacts the ability to focus, process, and store verbal information. So if your attention isn't online, which is what that withdrawal can look like, then really learning doesn't happen, right? Attention has to be online for things to get into your long-term memory. So impacts your ability to respond because you missed the content. So you missed the content, it didn't get coded in long-term memory, and you're not going to be able to retrieve it when you need it. So impacts your learning. Okay. Social emotional communication. So when language is used to control behavior versus responding to thoughts and feelings, they develop what they call an instrumental style of interacting. It's more like people are their purpose is to give me something. And I'm not saying that's like sociopathic or anything. They've just learned that other people are not often sources of joy, but they're more a means to an end. And that's the type of communication you might get from a child who's been exposed to trauma. Okay, so it's more about getting their needs met rather than authentic attachments. So organization, because executive functionings occur in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and that can be very impacted by exposure to trauma. That's an area of the brain also affected. And same in that area, the prefrontal cortex also helps us with cause and effect relationships. So understanding cause and effect can be really impactful when a kid is exposed to trauma. A little bit more in the academic area, perspective taking can be a challenge because of the lack of empathy at times. Attentiveness, we talked about that a little bit with the hypoarousal. Regulating emotions, absolutely. Executive functions, I just kind of touched on. And engaging in the curriculum for lots of reasons. So classroom behavior, reactivity and impulsivity. I've heard lots of times teachers, kids will just come in and sort of self-sabotage the class because they're hyper-aroused and they're used to a certain level of environmental stimulus. And so what you might see is they come in and they're trying to kind of bring the arousal level of the room up to what they're feeling inside. So that reactivity and impulsivity is something you might see. Aggression, defiance, And those first three really relate to the fight or flight response that we see with that stress response that children experience. Withdrawal might be more of the freeze or the hypoarousal experience that they go through. And then perfectionism, there can be a lot of anxiety that they experience because of that, their traumatic exposure, and wanting things to be controlled and just such because it helps them feel in control of their environment. Okay, so I'm going to jump into looking at some of our current educational frameworks that we can embed some of these trauma-informed practices into. I'm sure you've all heard of multi-tiered systems of support. I'd like to call it RTI 2.0 squared because it's really RTI that's been around forever. And then we took academic RTI and we split that triangle in half and said, all right, well, behavior is important too. Good, okay. And now we're kind of looking at it. And so PBIS got added to this side of the triangle. And now we gave it a brand new name and we added that we're going to have collaboration and evidence-based interventions and database decision-making into it, and add a whole new layer and called it MTSS. It's all fine and good, but it's a lot of the same structure that we've been working with for a long time. That's why I have that bad joke, RTI 2.0 squared. Okay. Haha, you guys are rolling on the floor laughing right now. That's great. Okay. So just like in RTI, we have our tier ones, which is universal supports that all kids get, right? And I am going to make the case that trauma-informed practice can apply universally. It benefits all kids, okay? And I'm going to give examples of that. Tier 2, targeted. So we have kids that are struggling either behaviorally, academically, emotionally, and we need some more targeted interventions for them. And they respond, we do our interventions, our database decision making, and we say, hey, great, they're more tier 1 now. They respond to our intervention. And then there's children who don't respond to tier 2 or seem to shoot straight from tier 1 to tier 3. And we have some intensive interventions that we need. And I have some nuggets of information for you guys at all levels. And my only critique of MTSS is that it's too academic behavior. We can't get around that. That's really important. But what I would advocate is we really have to look at embedding emotional regulation at all levels too, and looking at the whole child. So a child is more than their academic performance and their behavior, right? There's a whole other being there that we have to tap into and really help them self-actualize, to use the Maslow terminology, right? And so let's jump into it to embed something pretty simple from the research into MTSS. I have one of my favorite research studies, The 3 Pillars of Trauma-Informed Care by Howard Bath, 2008. There's lots and lots of more complex models out there. There's also a ton of parallel between what they all say. And this one pares down the 3 basic things that you really need to look at when we're embedding trauma-informed care into our systems. And I think we got to start small and start simple. That's my argument, because we can get too caught up in big systems change, and if it's too complex, it just won't move. It won't happen. So let's look at the basics of what you really need to embed into a system like MTSS to make it more trauma-informed. So first of all, children need to feel safe. I think based on what we've talked about so far, children exposed to trauma, they need to feel safe to be able to learn so that their traumas aren't triggered and taking them out of the game in the classroom, okay? We talked about attachment issues already with children exposed to trauma. So they need help sort of replicating positive attachments. They need more instruction. And that starts with us putting a really strong focus on building relationships with these kids. Even though they're the hardest kids, they're the ones that need it the most, okay? And finally, managing emotions. So that's one thing I would say in MTSS. There should be universal emotional regulation instruction, in my opinion. And a lot of districts do this. Second step, there's one called the Mind Up curriculum that I'm a big fan of. I think that's one little hole that we could look at in our systems. Where are we explicitly teaching children emotional regulation? Okay, and that's something that benefits all children, particularly children with adverse childhood experience or trauma backgrounds. Okay. As it typically goes, I only give myself 20 minutes to get to the part that was in the title of this training, but we're going to get there. And I'm going to give you some tidbits. My contact information will be at the end if you want more information. or interested in longer presentations in the future, we can talk about that. So let's jump into safety. What are some strategies to help students feel safe in the educational environment? And where do they plug into the multi-tier system of support? Okay, so safety. Something you do, have clear rules and consequences in your classroom. It's not enough just to have the rules on the board. They need to know that it's going to be a predictable environment, and that if we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. They come from unstable environments typically. Students are exposed to trauma, and so they really need that predictability in their environment. My clicker going to work here? There you go. Okay. Avoid being overly punitive. Alternatives to school suspension, like restorative justice, are something you could consider. Even in-school suspension, because the kiddos that get suspended are usually the ones that have the least amount of supervision at home when they get suspended, and so they're that much more alienated from the school environment. And there's research that shows that suspensions in school are correlated to higher rates of incarceration down the road. And so I think we do have to take a look at our discipline practices, and if suspension's your only tool, just like I said, if a hammer's your only tool, every problem looks like a nail, right? But kids are much more complex than that, and I think our responses to discipline need to take that in consideration. Okay. So rules and policies that address teasing and bullying. And I would also say in my current school, they're doing a great job in this area with gang paraphernalia and gang clothing. Unfortunately, I live and work in an environment where that's prevalent, and there's no worse way for kids to feel unsafe than feeling like their school is a hotbed of gang activity. So that may be going on under the surface. There's only so much we can do about that, but we can take some of the risk out by limiting what we'll allow at school as far as clothing and certain paraphernalia, right? And that'll help kids feel a little bit safer. And then also a clear and predictable classroom schedule. Okay. And back to bullying, take an inventory of the school. Be aware of hotspots on your campus where maybe fights occur or bullying occurs. Is it the locker room? Is it by a flight of stairs or something? Maybe survey your students on where some of these things occur and how they can feel more safe at school. Okay, again on safety. Emphasize the safety of adults in the school setting. So if you know a child has a traumatic background, which we often don't, unfortunately, you can take them around and teach or introduce them to staff members so that they feel the adults in their environment are familiar and safe. That's definitely something that would benefit children exposed to trauma. Something that fits already into MTSS as far as safety, having a school-wide behavior management system, something like PBIS, which I think just about all schools are doing these days, which is really exciting. And PBIS is, the research outcome is that is just decrease in suspensions and referrals. So right there, if you have a good prevention measure going on like PBIS, you're going to address some of the other safety issues like having a disproportionate amount of suspensions at your school. Giving them choice whenever, so a sense of agency, whether it's, I don't know, giving more input on their scheduling or opportunities to participate one way or another. I think a lot of schools do a good job of this with student leadership, school body, things like that. Choice is equal empowerment. So giving kids a sense of empowerment where they maybe felt like they didn't have that before is really, really important. And finally, I think trying to get this staff mentality, if everyone just accepted this mantra, I think we'd be in a much better place. And you may have heard this before. I'm not saying I invented it at all. But often we have a kid who's making our life hard in the classroom. We could easily go to that, dude, kid, what is wrong with you? Sorry to show my California there a little bit. But if we can reframe that and try and look at them through the lens of trauma and say, what happened to you? It totally flips it, right? We have so much more empathy for the child and patience for the child, even though they're making things difficult. But even there, just shifting that mentality from what's wrong with you to what happened to you can start to shape your school culture in a positive way where kids feel safer and more connected. Okay, on that note of connections. So we talked about insecure attachments in the developmental period can really impact students' future relationships. And often they have lack of social models in their environment. maybe aggressive or confrontational with adults. A lot of times that's them trying to seek power in that relationship so they don't feel threatened, okay? So that they're making your life hard. It's just they need to feel in control, okay? And we talked a little bit about, in the family environment, often there's in these types of environments, a coercive pattern where it becomes bribery or punitive to get anything done rather than, often kids will comply just out of love and relationship, right? But in these environments, it becomes more about bribery and threats. And so in our school environments, I think we have to try and build those relationships, build those connections, and have to try and get away from the bribery and threat part. You know, I'm all about PBIS. I love it. I'm all about other systems that I'll talk about next that give kids incentives throughout their day. It's all good. But the side product of doing those things is you're building relationships with these kids in a positive way. And that's really important. A couple quotes from my guy, Bruce Perry, I'm a groupie for this guy. I love this guy. Okay. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. There's nothing that repairs a child's traumatic experience more than having someone that cares about them and is connected to them. It's a resilience factor and probably one of the biggest ones. And you multiply that by the number of people available to the child, and all of a sudden there's positive attachments happening, and they're getting their needs met in more socially appropriate ways. And another one, a human-to-human interaction is regulating. When you're in the presence of people who are respectful, attentive, and attuned with you, literally your stress response system is better regulated. A tone of voice, a kind touch gives you a small dose of regulation. Okay, and so far we're talking about things that are universal. I haven't talked about anything beyond tier 1 right now. We should all be trying to build relationships with kids, and I feel like plenty of you are out there. But sometimes we get burned out, we forget, maybe we shout at kids in our classroom out of just instinct or reflex, and that's hard on the relationships with kids. Okay, I do have to plug Nurtured Heart here, especially in the connection area. If you're not familiar with it, visit childrensuccessfoundation.com. I don't have a lot of time to go into it here, but it is a way to embed relationship-based strategies into connecting with your kids. And it was developed with working with some of the most intense kids, okay? It's evidence-informed, means all the principles behind it are in line with established evidence-based research, okay? It's being implemented in schools, homes, therapeutic settings nationally and internationally. And what it does is it trains adults to see the good where it's slipping through the cracks, because there's always good. No kid is bad all the time. But we sort of get hyper-fixated sometimes on seeing the negative. It becomes our instinct. But you could train the brain and your perception to look for the good, no matter how small, in any child. And there's specific strategies on how to recognize that and how to keep yourself emotionally regulated when you are dealing with difficult kids, so you don't give them the big explosive reactions that they're almost trying to set you up for. So it's a very powerful methodology. In fact, New Jersey's Child and Family Services is I think a $12 million grant or something they're trying to implement across their all their children's systems of care in New Jersey right now. And there's actually a research study going on in Arizona currently, and the results will be out in spring on the impact of Nurtured Heart with children with ADHD. So the big bottom line is Nurtured Heart applies to all settings when we're talking about relationships, all 3 tiers, okay? And it's something you can use to kind of get everyone in the staff speaking the same language with your students. Shameless plug over. Here we go. Okay. Other strategies for developing connections. I see I only have 10 minutes. Been blabbing on, haven't I? Tier 2, a check-in, check-out system so that students start their day connecting with a positive adult, reviewing goals and incentives, and are continuing to check in during a day on progress on those goals. I have students that are frequent flyers to my counseling office right now. It's becoming a little bit of an issue. I'm just, I guess, a really fun guy to avoid class and come see or something. And I think if we got ahead of it and said these are the times where you can come and check in, and we attach some behavioral incentives to really support the kid, then we're getting ahead of that class avoidance, and we're building a relationship at the same time. Big buddies, cross-age tutors. So it's not just adults that can benefit other kids with relationships. We need to teach them how to bond with their peers, right? Greeting students, standing outside your door and greeting them as they come in. It's easy to just forget and let them come in, open up your books, but starting every interaction in your classroom with a positive engagement is really important. Something new we're doing in my school this year is we're designating kids that are high profile with what we call 2x10 strategies. So 10 times in a given week, I'm going to have a 2-minute non-contingent conversation with a kid. Not that like I am asking, how are you doing in this class? Anything like that. I'm not trying to get anything out of you. I'm just showing you pure attention as a human being. And that's something we're doing right now in my school. Really exciting. Excuse me. Buddy benches. So if kids are having troubles connecting socially, some schools do this where there's a bench on the playground, and if you're sitting on it, it means you want someone to play with. And other kids know that. We teach that in the early classroom or school-wide rules, right? And it gives other kids an opportunity, like, okay, I'll play with you. And kids are amazingly therapeutic to other kids. That's one of the best connections you can help them make is with other kids, okay? Parent outreach and home visits. So making the parent feel comfortable at school says a lot to the kid. Like these environments, they coalesce and they work, and my mom or dad is welcome here at school. So building the school-home connections is also an important factor to consider in trauma-informed practices. Other curriculums out there, like Have You Fill the Bucket Today, Growing Up with a Bucket Full of Happiness, more for the middle school range. It really helps empower kids to notice other kids. It's in line with sort of Nurture Heart, and fill their buckets with positive praise. And a lot of schools are implementing this as a school-wide measure as well. And then again, it's about building the relationships. Okay. Managing emotions. Okay, this is from that BASS study I talked about. A primary focus of work with traumatized children needs to be on teaching and supporting them to learn new ways of effectively managing their emotions and impulses. And again, if I had my way, mindfulness strategies like this one curriculum, the Mind Up curriculum, would be embedded. I think yoga, which is a trauma-informed practice, would be an amazing tier 2 intervention. I think if kids heard about it, all the kids would want to take yoga in school. The physiological and psychological response and regulation that happens from these type of practices is evidence-based. So things along those lines, I think, should be much more universal. Maybe yoga is a bit in the distance, but there's a lot of great curriculums that if we put in the effort in our leadership in our districts and schools, and we go beyond just academics behavior, when we look at the emotional regulation part, that we can embed into the schools. And I'm pretty much still at tier 1 right now, folks, of things we can do for kids who have experienced trauma that will benefit all kids. And that's a win-win, right? So let's get into that. Another one, collaborative and proactive solutions, is one I'm a strong advocate for. It used to be collaborative problem solving. Dr. Ross Green is the author. And it's empirically supported evidence-based treatment out of California, evidence-based clearinghouse for child welfare. And up here, I kind of give you the outline of what it looks like in a very, very basic form, okay? And first of all, as I talked about with Siegel's work, parenting the whole brain child, you have to really hear a child and hear their emotions first. That's the right brain. We have to speak to the right brain with empathy before we can get into the left brain, the logic. We often want to jump to problem solving too quick. And when kids with trauma, they don't want to hear that. They need their emotions to be affirmed and acknowledged before they can jump into problem solving, which is typically a more higher cortical function, okay? And I think collaborative and proactive solutions taps into that, because at first I want to hear the student's perspective. Let them speak their piece, okay? Listen attentively. Don't just be thinking about what your response is going to be. Nothing drives a kid crazier than that, right? Or anybody, period. And repeat back to ensure the problem is understood clearly. So you're showing empathy, you're showing attunement and attention, and then you clarify and explain the situation from the staff perspective. All right, so I'm not just going to jump in and give you my perspective. I'm going to let you say yours, and then make sure you're heard clearly. And then I'm going to share mine, okay? And then staff invites the student to come up with solutions. So we bring them into a problem-solving dynamic. And early on, as you're teaching kids this, you might just get the weirdest things you just can't do, right? But through this process, you're modeling proactive problem-solving with kids, which is a really great skill. You're showing them empathy, and you're teaching them self-regulation. Like, we can have a conversation over this even though you're really emotional and upset. Okay, I hear that, I understand. And we're going to work towards an agreeable solution together. Okay, so it gives the kids a sense of control, so it sort of speaks to the safety part of it, and it teaches pro-social collaboration, communication, and problem-solving skills. And unfortunately, problem-solving is often something we teach outside of school when a kid is suspended or up for expulsion, and we make them do this class. And there's no evidence that supports that as effective. So if it's embedded just in the school culture within the day, then something like collaborative and proactive solutions can be a really great way universally that staff can interact with kids and problem solve with them and model that for them. Again, we're tier 1, but this could be used all the way up the MTSS triangle, depending on what's the presenting concern. Another one that's pretty much a tier 3 that's out of California, the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools. I think this intervention is actually even mentioned in the legislature that passed in the spring. It's great. It's a totally free online platform. You know, certain credentials would be best, I believe, to doing this as school psychologist, school counselor, school social worker. But if you want more cognitive behavioral strategies, particularly those for students who are exposed to trauma, it's online training. You can download the workbook for free. You can get the printable version for a very small cost also. But it's designed to reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, behavioral problems, and improve functioning, grades, attendance, and it's an evidence-based practice. So definitely Google that. It's, like I said, it's free. Maybe have districts, work groups among school psychologists, counselors, social workers trained, you know, in effective trauma-informed support like this. Something to look at within your districts and within your cohorts, depending on school counselor, school psychologist, whoever you are. I'm currently trying to go through the online platform myself. It's just takes time, and time is something we don't all have. But if we're diligent about it and we make it a goal within our districts, this is something that can be available to a lot more care staff, and it would be, like I said, something beneficial at the higher tiers of the MTSS. A few curriculums that I like personally that are good and can be used in the classroom, can be used tier 2, tier 3. Superflex curriculum, which really looks at social thinking, so children on the spectrum who struggle socially or with really rigid thinking, which you might see in children exposed to trauma. The Superflex curriculum is really great. Anything that embeds 5-point scaling, because it really helps kids understand their emotional awareness a little bit more and give them strategies. So when my worries get too big, an incredible 5-point scale are great ones. And then zones of regulation, which is one that can be done on a classroom level or in a small group level, are things that can teach that emotional regulation skills. And these are all ones I'm familiar with. There's hundreds of them out there, but these are ones that I think are great. I don't have any personal stake in these. Don't think I have endorsements I get out of this or anything. They're just really great curriculums. Again, 5-point scales are not things that you only do in a counseling setting. I think this is something you can embed into your classrooms to teach emotional regulation. Like I said, there's clipboard examples on this one slide. And that way it helps you communicate with kids. I've seen, if you look on Pinterest, you'll get a million, yes, I have a Pinterest, okay. And I love it, I'm not ashamed of it, okay. You'll see a million different 5-point scale strategies. Some are 3 jars, and the kids will maybe have 3 popsicle sticks with their names on it or something, and when they come in from recess or something, they'll just put their stick where it goes, whether I'm a 1, 2, or 3, or whatever your scaling is. And then you see, okay, who put their popsicle stick in a 5? Okay, I'm going to make sure I take a minute and check in with Johnny or Sally or whoever it is, right? So there's ways we can make these things more universal and embed emotional regulation into our MTSS, and that benefits all kids, particularly kids exposed to trauma. Other little classroom supports, like I said, I went a little Pinterest crazy. Wacky sacks, little balloons you could fill with Play-Doh or other things. I think the foam pool noodle was a pretty cool idea. Just cut it into slices, very economical. You can get those at the dollar store for $1. And you can probably make 50 of them out of one of those. And it's just a little squish fidget for kids that are maybe feeling hyper aroused. Calm down jars, I have one of these in my office. Kids love it. Every single day they play with it. And it's something you could have in a little kit in your room, so the kids don't have to feel like they have to leave to get the emotional support they need to take a brain break, okay? And you have these little almost like survival kits in your room, or a safe space in your classroom where kids can go if they just need a minute, okay? And then they feel included, and you don't have to send them somewhere where it could ramp up. Another one I thought was really cool, build an anxiety kit. So this is another one. You could click that link when this is put up. to give you some ideas on strategies. And again, kids need to be shown how to use these things appropriately, so it has to be modeled. You can't say, hey, go over use the anxiety kit over there. That won't work. So you have to kind of model it for them, and then they'll get to a point where they can independently access this stuff, and it will help them learn emotional regulation strategies. Because one thing kids struggle with in the counseling setting I'm constantly teaching is new anxiety strategies, anxiety management strategies. The last thing I'll say, and I know I'm a couple minutes over, giving you guys time for questions. Okay. All good. It all starts with awareness, right? And that's kind of what we're doing right now. But if you want to take this information back to your districts and start to make the case, like I think we need to build more social emotional supports for kids with trauma. We need to be better at building relationships, making connections with kids. We need to look at our safety practices and make sure they feel safe here. It starts with awareness, like talk to your school board, talk to your district about trauma-informed supports. There's some really impactful films that are screened out there, one called Paper Tigers, one called Resilience, that are all about trauma-informed practices and implementing them in the schools. We're doing a book study at my current school with this book, Fostering Resilient Learners. And so that's something we're taking on as a school to try and get everybody a little bit more informed about classroom strategies that can support students exposed to trauma. So really we're at that stage right now of awareness and outreach. And I've given you some strategy of what you can do throughout all the tiers. And to be honest, I've scratched the surface with the hour and a half I've had today. There's a lot more out there, but I hope you got some good insights into the state of affairs in Utah, the state of ACEs, what it means to be exposed to trauma in an educational setting, and some tidbits of information what we can do within our current educational structure to benefit these kids. So namaste, thank you. And I'll put my contact info up here, and if there's any questions beyond what we have time for today, feel free to look me up. But we have about pretty good 15 minutes left for questions if there's anything. Feel free to fire away, and I think Corby and Amanda are going to help coordinate that. They're compiling the questions at this moment, I think.
Well, so probably just
Okay.
Yeah, so I got a question for you.
Okay, Corey.
There you go.
So Nick, when should trauma-informed care should start? Should it start in elementary school? Or, I mean, when should it start?
Great question. I mean, given that the biggest impact, to be honest with you, in the neurodevelopmental impact of trauma is the 0 to 5 age range, I think having some early screeners in our preschool programs would be really beneficial. So we're identifying children early. But absolutely within the elementary system, we should have some screenings, some practices in place, because I don't care what neighborhood you live in. If you're in the business of being a school social worker, school counselor, school psychologist, students are going to come your way. They're going to come your way who have been exposed to trauma. And sometimes we're just scratching our head on what to do. But if we have early intervention systems in place, we're going to have better lifetime outcomes for students the earlier we intervene. Absolutely.
I know you mentioned minor, you mentioned second step. Could you kind of dig in deeper about those programs, or just a little tad bit surface of them?
Sure, absolutely. Mind Up is a really easy to use curriculum. It's about 16 lessons, and it does some neuropsychological lessons for the kids. They learn about the brain. They learn to use the common terminology, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and understand what those parts of their brains are doing when they're experiencing stress, anxiety, anger. Okay, so there's psychoeducation that goes into it. And every lesson has a mindfulness strategy, whether it's what they call the core practice, which is mindful breathing, mindful tasting, mindful listening, mindful movement. So it really goes through lots of different lessons on mindfulness practices that kids can use. And second step is good, and it's evolved. When I was in my second year of grad school, it was really old, and it even referred to records still. But they've come out with some, I know, what's a record? I think they're talking about CDs now, which is good, whatever that is, right? No, I'm not taking a shot at it because I think it's really good, actually. I'm just making a joke on where it's come from. But second step embeds a lot of the problem-solving strategies, emotional regulation, and also social skills involved in it. So those are both really well-known social-emotional curriculums. If you want to look at more, I think CASEL, I don't remember what it stands for, but CASEL.org. Don't quote me on that part either. But it's a whole clearinghouse of evidence-based social-emotional curriculums. So those are a couple that I'm familiar with and pretty fond of.
So you mentioned about screening early with our laws in Utah with the FERPA law, and so a person asks, how can we cover the new screening with our laws here in Utah? How do we handle that?
It's a good question, and I'm not a native Utahn. I just came here in December last year, as a matter of fact. But I worked on work groups in California, and the county I worked in California, we had several work groups because our ACEs, just to give you a little perspective, I think about 67% of our population had one or more, and about 33% had four or more. So it was the highest in the state, the county that I lived in. So there were some really aggressive work groups going on in our state to look at some of those things, like the early intervention and pre-screening education, and then also getting trauma-informed practice going on in systems. We struggled with those same conversations. That's the reason I bring it up. Part of it was we want to get updated ACEs data so we really know a current snapshot of what's going on. We talked about having those anonymously provided at kindergarten registration, no names on it. We just want to get a current snapshot on what might be going on in the household. But I can understand that could be, with the privacy laws in Utah, an extra barrier. I can't pretend that I have the exact solution to that, but I think you bring up a great point.
So
We had one person asking about access to the slides and your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I can make it available in PDF format. I'm fine with that. I don't know where you guys post or what the mechanisms are. But I know there's loaded a lot of info, and we had a pretty fast pace today. I'd be happy to put those up.
So FYI, the slides will be posted later, and there will be a link sent out so you can review this webinar at a later date, just in case you missed it.
So
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate your passion to helping kids. And to close this out, I just want to do a little spiel to close this webinar. And I would just like to say that trauma, it doesn't discriminate. It can happen to the poor. It can happen to the wealthy. It can happen to black people. It can happen to white people. I mean, it can happen to anyone. And so as an educator here in Utah, we have to take the next step and be aware and be knowledgeable on trauma and how it impacts student learning, student behavior, and impact their life later as an adult. And I believe that trauma is the #1 public health problem that is being unaddressed nationwide, not just here in Utah, but nationwide. And as an educator, we should take the step, we should take the initiative to be proactive and be able to help our kids achieve what they want to achieve, no matter what's been going on in their lives. And to truly have educational equity, we must address all parts of the kid, the whole child of the kid, and we cannot just focus on one area. And I would say just take this back, make this available. Please educate other people around you, other educators, and thank you so much for your time, and see you next month for our next webinar series. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you guys for participating.